The hunger gnawed at Josephine Zander's empty stomach as she stumbled down the dusty main street of Redemption Creek, a small mining town nestled in the foothills of the Colorado Territory. It was 1873, and the promise of a new life out west had withered like crops in a drought. The relentless summer sun beat down upon her shoulders, her once fine dress now tattered and stained from months of desperate travel. Josephine clutched the golden locket that hung around her neck, the last remnant of her former life in Boston. Inside was a small portrait of her parents, both lost to typhoid the previous winter. Their deaths had left her with nothing but debts and memories, forcing her to sell their modest home and seek opportunity in the expanding frontier. But misfortune had followed her westward. The stagecoach she'd been traveling on was robbed 3 days prior, the bandits taking everything except the clothes on her back and the locket she'd managed to hide. She hadn't eaten in 2 days, and the dizziness was becoming harder to ignore. Redemption Creek appeared to be thriving compared to the ghost towns she'd passed through. A general store, saloon, and assortment of businesses lined the street. Josephine straightened her posture and smoothed her dress as best she could, determined to maintain some dignity despite her circumstances. The bell above the general store door jingled as she entered. The proprietor, a portly man with spectacles perched on his nose, looked up from his ledger. "Good afternoon, miss. What can I help you with today?" he asked, though his expression changed when he took in her disheveled appearance. Josephine approached the counter, her fingers nervously working at the chain around her neck. I was hoping to make a trade." The shopkeeper's eyebrows rose. "A trade? I don't typically barter, miss. Cash is preferable." "I have no money," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. With trembling hands, she unclasped the locket and placed it on the counter. "But this is gold. Genuine. It should be worth enough for some food and perhaps a night's lodging." The shopkeeper picked up the locket, examining it closely. "It's a fine piece," he acknowledged. "But I'm not in the jewelry business. I wouldn't know how to properly value such an item." "Please," Josephine said, hating the desperation in her voice. "I haven't eaten in days." The bell above the door jingled again, and a tall figure stepped into the store, momentarily blocking the afternoon sunlight. The newcomer wore dusty riding clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. "Afternoon, Mr. Patterson," the man said to the shopkeeper, his voice deep and pleasant. "Got that order of fence wire in yet?" "Just arrived yesterday, Mr. Jameson. It's out back." The man stepped closer, and Josephine could now see his face tanned by the sun, with clear blue eyes and a strong jawline partially covered by several days' worth of stubble. He was younger than she'd initially thought, perhaps in his late 20s. "Thank you," he replied, but his gaze had shifted to the locket on the counter. "That's a mighty fine piece. The young lady here is looking to trade it for supplies," the shopkeeper explained. "I was just telling her I'm not equipped to value such an item." The stranger, Mr. Jameson, studied Josephine, taking in her worn appearance and the proud tilt of her chin despite her obvious distress. "May I?" he asked, gesturing toward the locket. Josephine nodded, and the shopkeeper handed it to him. The man examined it carefully, opening it to reveal the portraits inside. "Your family?" he asked softly. "My parents," she answered. "They've passed." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition of a shared pain, perhaps. "I'm sorry to hear that." He closed the locket and looked at her directly. "This is valuable." "Too valuable to trade for a simple meal." Josephine's heart sank. "Sir, I have nothing else." He handed the locket back to her, not to the shopkeeper. "Mr. Patterson, please provide the lady with whatever provisions she requires. Put it on my account." Josephine stared at him in disbelief. "I cannot accept charity, sir. I insist on paying my way." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "It's not charity. It's an investment." "An investment in what, exactly?" He tipped his hat slightly. "In your future, miss. That locket shouldn't be traded away out of desperation. Keep it safe." His eyes held hers as he added, "Wear it when you're my bride." The audacity of his statement left her speechless. Before she could recover, he turned to the shopkeeper. "Give her a week's worth of supplies, and arrange a room for her at Mrs. Foster's boarding house." Then, to Josephine, "I'm Hayes Jameson. I have a ranch about 5 miles outside of town. When you're ready to discuss my proposal properly, you can find me there." With that, he nodded politely and exited the store, leaving Josephine clutching her locket, her hunger temporarily forgotten in the face of such an unexpected encounter. "Well," Mr. Patterson said, breaking the silence. "That's the most words I've heard Hayes Jameson speak at once in the 3 years he's lived here." He began gathering items from the shelves. "He's a good man, miss. Keeps to himself mostly, but fair in his dealings. Built that ranch from nothing after the war." Josephine fastened the locket around her neck again. "He cannot be serious about what he said." The shopkeeper shrugged. "Hayes isn't known for jesting. But don't you worry, he won't force the issue. Not his way." He paused, setting a tin of coffee on the counter. "Now, what else will you be needing?" Later that evening, settled in a small but clean room at Mrs. Foster's boarding house, Josephine sat on the edge of the bed with a full stomach for the first time in days. The elderly landlady had provided a hot meal and even some clean clothes that had belonged to her daughter, who'd moved to San Francisco. Josephine held the locket in her palm, running her thumb over the engraved surface. The man Hayes Jameson had been right about one thing. The locket was too precious to trade away. It contained the only images she had of her parents, the only tangible connection to her past. But his proposal was absurd. She didn't know him. He didn't know her. What kind of man offered marriage to a destitute stranger? Mrs. Foster had provided some context over dinner. Hayes Jameson had arrived in Redemption Creek after the Civil War, where he'd served with distinction in the Union Army. He'd purchased a struggling cattle operation and, through hard work and determination, transformed it into one of the most prosperous ranches in the territory. He employed several local men and was known for his fair treatment of his workers, including the Mexican vaqueros who others in the region often discriminated against. "He keeps to himself," Mrs. Foster had said, "but there's not a soul in this town who wouldn't vouch for his character. Lost his family young, from what I understand. Some say that's why he's never married, no family to arrange it, and too busy building his ranch to court properly." Josephine placed the locket on the bedside table and prepared for sleep. Whatever Mr. Jameson's motivations, she had more pressing concerns. She needed to find employment, a way to sustain herself. The supplies he'd purchased would last a week, but then what? She couldn't depend on the charity of strangers, no matter how intriguing they might be. The next morning, Josephine set about searching for work in Redemption Creek. She inquired at the hotel, the restaurant, and even the schoolhouse, but opportunities for a young woman with no local references were scarce. By mid-afternoon, she found herself outside the town's newspaper office, the Redemption Creek Chronicle. The editor, an older gentleman named Walter Simmons, listened patiently to her request for employment. "I was educated at a ladies' seminary in Boston," she explained. "I'm proficient in English and literature. I can write, edit, and I have a fair hand for copying." Mr. Simmons stroked his beard thoughtfully. "It's just me running this operation, Miss Zander. I don't know that I can afford to hire an assistant. I would work for very modest wages," she pressed, "and I'm willing to learn any aspect of the business." After further consideration, he agreed to a trial arrangement 3 days a week, assisting with typesetting and copy editing. The pay would barely cover her room at the boarding house, but it was a start. As she left the newspaper office, Josephine spotted Hayes Jameson emerging from the bank across the street. Their eyes met briefly before he tipped his hat in acknowledgement. She returned a polite nod, then continued on her way, ignoring the flutter in her stomach. For the next 2 weeks, Josephine settled into a routine. She worked diligently at the newspaper, impressing Mr. Simmons with her attention to detail and quick learning. On her days off, she assisted Mrs. Foster with the boarding house chores in exchange for reduced rent. In the evenings, she often sat on the porch, watching the sunset and pondering her next steps. She hadn't seen Hayes Jameson since that day outside the newspaper office, though she'd heard his name mentioned frequently around town, always with respect, occasionally with curiosity about the reclusive rancher who rarely participated in town social events. On a Friday afternoon, as Josephine was completing her work at the Chronicle, Mr. Simmons approached her desk. "There's been some trouble out at the Jameson Ranch," he said, setting down a hastily scribbled note. "One of his ranch hands was injured in a stampede. Hayes is looking for someone who can read and write well enough to help with correspondence and accounts while his foreman recovers." Josephine felt her pulse quicken. "And you thought of me? You're the most educated person in town besides the schoolteacher and the doctor." both of whom are otherwise occupied. Plus, you mentioned needing additional work. He adjusted his spectacles. The pay would be good. Hayes Jameson doesn't skimp when it comes to fair wages. She hesitated. Working at the Jameson Ranch would mean regular interaction with the man who had made that outlandish proposal. Yet she couldn't deny that she needed the money, and the position sounded well suited to her abilities. "I'll consider it," she said finally. "Don't consider too long," Mr. Simmons replied. Hayes mentioned he'd be in town tomorrow to pick up supplies. Said he'd stop by to see if you're interested. That evening, Josephine paced her small room, weighing her options. The practical side of her argued that this was exactly the opportunity she needed: steady employment that would allow her to save money and eventually move on to a larger town with more prospects. The cautious side worried about the implications of working closely with a man who had so boldly suggested marriage upon their first meeting. In the end, practicality won. When Hayes Jameson appeared at the Chronicle office the following day, Josephine agreed to visit the ranch to discuss the position further. The Jameson Ranch was larger than she'd imagined, with a handsome main house constructed of sturdy logs and stone, several outbuildings, and corrals containing horses in various stages of training. A bunkhouse stood a respectful distance from the main house, and beyond stretched fenced pastures where cattle grazed. Hayes himself showed her around, explaining the operation with quiet pride. He'd built most of it with his own hands, he told her, starting with just the small cabin that now served as a storage shed. "The main house has a proper office," he explained, leading her inside. The interior was surprisingly comfortable: simple but well-crafted furniture, clean floors covered with woven rugs, and bookshelves filled with volumes that suggested their owner was more educated than the average rancher. The office contained a large desk, filing cabinets, and a smaller writing desk positioned near a window with a view of the mountains. "Miguel, my foreman, handled most of the record-keeping and correspondence," Hayes explained. "But he broke his arm and 2 ribs in the stampede. Doctor says he needs at least 6 weeks of recovery." "I'm sorry to hear about his injuries," Josephine said sincerely. "What exactly would my duties entail?" "Keeping the accounts, writing letters to buyers and suppliers, maintaining the breeding records for the horses." He gestured to the smaller desk. "You'd work here 3 days a week to start. More if needed during busy periods. I can send a wagon to bring you from town and return you in the evenings." The arrangement sounded reasonable, and the wage he offered was generous. After discussing the specifics, Josephine agreed to begin the following Monday. As Hayes walked her back to the wagon that would return her to town, he paused. "Miss Zander, about what I said when we first met, there's no need to explain, Mr. Jameson," she interrupted, feeling her cheeks warm. "I understand it was said in the moment." He studied her face. "No, it wasn't. But I do recognize it was forward of me. I've never been skilled with words or social graces." He looked away, toward the distant mountains. "I won't mention it again unless you wish to discuss it. You have my word that your position here is based solely on your qualifications, nothing more." Josephine nodded, oddly disappointed and relieved simultaneously. "Thank you for clarifying. I look forward to beginning work on Monday." The arrangement proved beneficial for both parties. Josephine quickly mastered the ranch's accounting system and improved upon it, creating a more efficient method of tracking expenses and income. Hayes was impressed by her intelligence and work ethic, while she came to appreciate his fair-mindedness and the respect he showed to everyone who worked for him, regardless of their background or position. They settled into a comfortable routine. 3 days a week, Josephine arrived at the ranch early in the morning and worked until late afternoon. Hayes would often bring her coffee and sometimes join her for lunch, during which they discussed books, current events, or the operations of the ranch. As the weeks passed, Josephine learned more about the quiet rancher. He'd grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith who had taught him the value of hard work and honesty. He'd fought at Gettysburg and other major battles, experiences he rarely discussed. After the war, with his parents deceased and no siblings, he'd headed west to start anew. In turn, she shared stories of her life in Boston, her education, and the circumstances that had brought her to Redemption Creek. Hayes proved to be an attentive listener, offering thoughtful responses rather than empty platitudes. One afternoon, about 2 months into her employment, Josephine was working on correspondence when Hayes entered the office, his expression troubled. "Is something wrong?" she asked, setting down her pen. "Just received word that a band of rustlers hit the Davidson place last night," he replied, referring to a neighboring ranch. "Took 20 head of cattle and injured one of their hands pretty badly." Josephine frowned. "How terrible. Do they know who's responsible?" "Same group that's been causing trouble up and down the valley for months now. Sheriff's forming a posse to track them. I'll be joining them tomorrow at first light." Concern flashed across her face before she could mask it. "Is that necessary? Surely the sheriff has deputies who are trained for such pursuits." A small smile touched Hayes's lips. "Worried about me, Miss Zander?" She busied herself with reorganizing papers. "I'm concerned about the ranch's operations in your absence. Mr. Alvarez is still recovering, after all. Miguel can oversee things from the house now, even with his arm in a sling." He paused. "But I appreciate your concern, whatever its nature." Their eyes met, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. Josephine was the first to look away, suddenly conscious of how much she had come to care for this man over the past weeks. "Please be careful," she said softly. "I will." He hesitated, then added, "I have more reason to return safely than I did before." The posse was gone for 4 days, during which time Josephine found it difficult to concentrate on her work. She visited the ranch as usual, helping Miguel manage operations and trying not to dwell on the potential dangers Hayes might be facing. When the men finally returned, they brought with them most of the stolen cattle and 3 captured rustlers. The rest of the gang had escaped into the mountains. Hayes appeared at the ranch house dusty and exhausted, with a minor bullet graze on his left arm that he'd allowed the town doctor to treat before riding home. Josephine was in the office when he arrived. She rose from her desk at the sight of him, relief washing over her. "You're hurt," she said, noticing the bandage beneath his torn shirt sleeve. "It's nothing, barely a scratch." He removed his hat, running a hand through his hair. "I'm more in need of a bath and a proper meal than medical attention." Without thinking, she crossed the room and placed her hand on his uninjured arm. "I'm glad you're back safely." His expression softened as he covered her hand with his own. "So am I." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken emotions. Then, remembering herself, Josephine stepped back. "I should let you rest. I've left the weekly accounts on your desk for review when you're ready." Hayes caught her hand before she could retreat further. "Josephine." It was the first time he'd used her given name. "Would you join me for dinner tonight? Not as my employee, but as my guest." Her heart quickened. "Yes," she answered simply. "I would like that." That evening marked a turning point in their relationship. Over a meal prepared by the ranch cook, they spoke not of work but of hopes and dreams, of music and art, of places they'd seen and places they wished to visit. Hayes revealed a dry wit that made her laugh, while Josephine shared stories of her childhood adventures that brought genuine smiles to his usually serious countenance. As he escorted her to the wagon that would return her to town, Hayes paused beneath the star-filled sky. "I meant what I said that first day, Josephine. About the locket." His voice was quiet but steady. "I know it was presumptuous. I know we'd only just met. But sometimes you just know." Josephine's hand went to the locket that still hung around her neck. "I thought you were mad," she admitted, "or making light of my situation. I've never been more serious about anything in my life." He took her hand gently. "I'm not asking for an answer now. I'm just asking for a chance to court you properly, if you're willing." She looked up at him, this man who had shown her nothing but respect and kindness from the moment they'd met. "I'm willing," she said softly. The courtship that followed was conducted with the same quiet sincerity that characterized everything Hayes did. There were rides across the ranch lands, picnics by the creek that gave the town its name, and evenings spent reading aloud to each other on the porch of the main house. Hayes introduced Josephine to his favorite horses and taught her to ride properly. She, in turn, shared her knowledge of literature and music, even coaxing him to join her in song when she discovered an old piano in a rarely used parlor. Josephine continued her work at both the ranch and the newspaper, establishing herself as a respected member of the community. As autumn approached, Hayes suggested that she move into the ranch house permanently with proper chaperonage, of course. The elderly aunt of one of his ranch hands was happy to take on the role, giving Josephine a freedom and comfort she hadn't experienced since her parents' passing. It was on a crisp October evening, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the backdrop of pine-covered mountains, that Hayes formally proposed. They had ridden to a promontory overlooking the valley, where the ranch buildings looked like miniatures in the distance. "This land was nothing but potential when I first saw it," Hayes said, standing beside her as they gazed at the vista. "Just like my life was nothing but potential after the war. I knew what it could be, though, with enough care and attention." He turned to face her. "And then you arrived in town, and suddenly I realized there was something missing from all I'd built." Josephine met his gaze, her heart full. Over the months, she had come to understand this man, his integrity, his gentle strength, his capacity for love that had remained untapped for so long. "What was missing?" she asked softly, though she knew the answer. "Someone to share it with. Someone who could see beyond the rough exterior to what I was trying to create." He took her hands in his. "Someone like you, Josephine." From his pocket, he withdrew a small box. Inside was a ring, a simple gold band set with a single pearl. "It was my mother's," he explained. "I've kept it all these years, waiting for the right person to wear it." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes as he knelt before her. "Josephine Zander, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Will you wear that locket when you're my bride, just as I asked on the day we met?" "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will." Their wedding took place in November, a simple but joyful affair attended by the townspeople who had come to know and respect them both. Josephine wore a new dress of ivory silk, and around her neck hung the golden locket that had brought them together. As winter settled over the ranch, Josephine and Hayes found happiness in their shared life. The main house, once merely functional, became a warm home filled with conversation and laughter. Hayes expanded his business interests, with Josephine's capable assistance, to include a partnership in a local silver mine. Their prosperity allowed them to improve conditions for their workers and contribute to the development of Redemption Creek, which was growing steadily as the railroad prepared to extend a line through the valley. Spring brought news that filled them both with nervous excitement. Josephine was expecting their first child. Hayes's joy was matched only by his protectiveness, though he learned quickly that his independent wife had no intention of being treated as fragile, even in her condition. "I married a rancher's wife, not a hothouse flower," he conceded with a smile after Josephine insisted on continuing her work well into her pregnancy. Their daughter, Eleanor Margaret Jameson, was born on a sunny September day in 1874, almost exactly 1 year after Hayes and Josephine's first meeting. She had her father's blue eyes and her mother's determined spirit, evident from her first lusty cries. As Josephine rested in their bedroom, Hayes sat beside her, cradling their newborn daughter with a tenderness that brought tears to his wife's eyes. "She's perfect," he whispered, touching the baby's tiny hand with a finger that seemed enormous in comparison. Josephine reached up to touch the locket around her neck, the locket she had nearly traded away in her desperation, the locket that now contained not only the portraits of her parents, but also a small lock of Eleanor's dark hair. "When I arrived in Redemption Creek, I had nothing but this locket and the clothes on my back," she said softly. "Now look at all we have." Hayes leaned down to kiss her forehead. "You never had nothing, Josephine. You had courage and determination and a spirit that wouldn't be broken. Those are the things I fell in love with that very first day. When I tried to trade my locket for food, and a presumptuous cowboy suggested I save it for our wedding day," she teased. He smiled, the smile that had become more frequent and freer over their time together. "I prefer to think of it as foresight rather than presumption." Josephine reached out to caress their daughter's cheek. "Well, Mr. Jameson, your foresight has given us quite a wonderful life. And it's only just beginning," he promised, taking her hand in his as their daughter slept peacefully between them, the first of the many blessings their union would bring. In the years that followed, the Jameson ranch thrived, as did the family that called it home. 2 more children joined Eleanor, a son, William, born 2 years later, and another daughter, Charlotte, 3 years after that. Redemption Creek grew into a prosperous town, with the Jamesons among its most respected citizens. Hayes served terms as both town councilman and county commissioner, while Josephine eventually purchased the Chronicle from Mr. Simmons when he retired, transforming it into one of the territory's most respected newspapers. Through it all, the golden locket remained a cherished symbol of their journey from a desperate encounter between strangers to a love that had built a legacy to last generations. And on their wedding anniversary each year, Hayes would remind Josephine of his words in the general store. "Wear it when you're my bride." Words that had seemed outlandish in the moment, but had proven to be the beginning of a story neither could have imagined on that fateful day when hunger and hope had brought them together.